Okay, so welcome everyone. So really important announcements. Please don't skip through them. The first and most important one is that the Google community will soon be closed, and I have decided that today I will not choose work from this wall. If you want your work looked at, you have to move over into Reddit. So I don't know how many of these 9,100 are active, but you all have to move over into Reddit now if you want to stay a part of the Critique Hour queue. If you want your work potentially looked at on the Critique Hour and critiqued by your fellow community. I wanted to also read something important from this announcement. Nothing is lost. The community is made up of us. It's not Google Plus that is this community. It is us. All of us here gathered together to talk about art. Where we go is where the community will be. Your friends will still be there on Reddit, as well as myself and the critiques that I offer and the critiques your friends offer, and all events pertaining to the community. There is no, as you can see with this transition, everything's still running very well. The reason why I want you guys to double post is for, back records, as well as the slight possibility that Google Plus won't shut down. At this point, I don't even know what's happening. But if it doesn't shut down, I still want the back record here as well, or backlog or whatever of previous posts. But yeah, please be aware that I am only choosing stuff from Reddit. The link for Reddit is right there at the top, pinned at the top of the community announcement. Please join it as soon as possible. If you're watching this, please stop, pause the video, and go join the Reddit, and post your work if you want it looked at on the community. Thank you so much. And for anyone interested, I just announced this month's Patreon assignment for apprentices. If you guys are interested in supporting me on Patreon, click on go to istebrak.com and click on the support me on Patreon. Updates for the private tutoring tier, still not yet decided. I can only offer it if I have an opening between all of the private tutoring that I do offer for students, the full price private tutoring, the one-on-one. The private tutoring tier for apprenticeship is 5 students in a room, up to 5, possibly 4. And it's a significant price drop as well. And it just has all of the usual curriculum that I offer in private tutoring, which is a lot of homework. You get a week between each session. In this case, it would be one session a month, and you have a massive body of work to complete before each class. Another big announcement is starting February 1st. You guys have your villain design, character design challenge, and it's not just a standing character design. Please spread the word. The design challenge is going to be a fantasy illustration, so it's going to be fantasy based, not sci-fi, not modern. And it is going to be a full illustration of a villain of choice. It has to be enough in the illustration that we can see the villain, but of course you have to base them in their environment so that you're building the environment around them to reflect them, what they're doing. Doesn't mean that it's not like a habitat, like designing the villain and their habitat, but you are placing them in an environment that helps describe a story. They could be sneaking up on someone, they could be in their little dungeon, they could be in their catacombs, whatever it is. It can be any kind of villain, but the key here is that you will be pulling from different references I'll provide in I don't think I can do today's class, my voice is gone, in the resource pack that I will be providing for starting February 1st. Also, Mac is now available for Portrait Studio is now available for Mac. I'll post a specific video, a dedicated video for this announcement. For February 1st, it will start. The store will open February 1st. I do have to talk about something very important. A lot of you purchased the Portrait Studio knowing that it's for PC. Those who purchased it for PC, apart from those who contacted me directly, and I had a conversation with them. So these are a number of people, like a handful of people. Everyone else will have to repurchase their copy for Mac. I'm so sorry. I have to do this. But a lot of you, it was very unfair because I announced it to everyone that Portrait Studio was not available for Mac, and people purchased it anyway. And when it is available for Mac, you're going to have to repurchase it. This keeps it fair for those who purchased it for Windows. They don't get multiple downloads. They just get the downloads available to them in their limit. People who purchased it for both are expecting a free download for Mac. It's an entirely separate store. And Portrait Studio is an entirely different software. It has different features, and it's programmed differently for Mac. If you had a PC and you bought it for PC and you also have a Mac on the side and you wanted to run Portrait Studio on that outside of Wine, you're going to have to buy it for Mac. Those who purchased it, again, and ran it on Wine, we let you know that Wine is a possibility for running Windows software on Mac, on iOS, or whatever it's called. But it's not recommended as there's different graphics components and requirements. Again, those who use the Wine option, you also have to repurchase it for Mac if you're interested in owning Portrait Studio for Mac. So I'm so sorry that I have to do it like this, but apart from those who I specifically gave permission to Abu to give them a free download once they get their Mac software, and this is for people who couldn't run it, this is for people who bought a more sustainable Mac device that can run Portrait Studio, this is for those who mistakenly bought it, didn't request a refund, and said once it's released, would I be able to own Portrait Studio? And then they spoke to me directly. They sent me an email. I discussed it with them back in September. Those will be the ones who get their free download. Okay? Thank you so much. I'm so sorry for this, but this is the official announcement for it. I won't discuss it outside of this stream. I will not be discussing it in the announcement video for the Mac release. And I will not be replying to emails apart from those who I already had a dialogue with regarding Portrait Studio for Mac. Okay? It just stays fair this way, and I've been announcing it for 2 years straight. Since it first came out, Portrait Studio was never available for Mac, and people bought it for their Mac, expecting it to be available for Mac anyways. It was right there on the checkout. It was right there on the description of the item, and yep. So make yourself a throat soothing tea for these streams. Got to stay hydrated. Yes, I do need a honey tea, absolutely, but I just didn't have any time. So please, if you want to join the contest, the villain contest, please prepare for it. You guys can start looking up references and mood boards now. And it's very exciting that Portrait Studio for Mac is finally available, because imagine, we've been ready to put it on a store since October. We've officially been ready for it, and it took Mac representatives from October till yesterday to finally approve of it, after they ran through every single little detail and made us, jump through hoops in order to produce it. This is why we're so strict with Mac right now, because we had to literally jump through hoops. We had to pay hundreds and hundreds of dollars to even be available on the store. And then we're going to have to pay again this year. They take 30% of all the profit, so it's like a sale that we don't get. And, it's like a sale price, but it's outside of sale season, which is super unfair for us. And all the work that Abu had to put in for the Mac release, it's just, they've made us jump through hoops, and we really wanted Mac users to be able to access Portrait Studio just as much as PC. I mean, we're all artists at the end of the day, but the amount of hoops they made us jump through is just unforgivable. So, it's really difficult for us to keep it fair for all of us who worked on it financially, and then who invested in it financially, and what we're getting back. Yeah, it's just been a hellstorm. But let's get started on today's Critique Hour. So today's Critique Hour is going to be about working without reference. Okie dokie. Oh, do I have this open? So what are some of your questions about working without reference? What is some stuff you guys want me to discuss? So I want to really incorporate your voice in today's script, what you guys want me to discuss, what your biggest fears are working without reference. Working with reference can be tricky because you allow the photo reference, if you have a good eye for value transitions, you allow the photo reference to make all the decisions for you. And there's not much thinking involved. There is a massive amount of overheating in your brain that happens when you're working without reference. And what you have to do is break down the anatomical requirements to run that feature. If it's the eye, if it's the nose, if it's the mouth, and you have to make sure that it's a checklist that you're going through for all the anatomical requirements in a portrait, let's say. A photo reference will give you all that information and not ask you why. You have to ask the why factor. Why do I need this functional component for the eye? Why do I need this component? So I'm going to list them out to you actually, and I expect you guys to, write them back to me. I expect them in your notes. I believe there is a class notes category in the Reddit right now, but I'm still going strong with the class notes rewards. So make sure that you are taking notes and posting them. The rewards vary from my brushes to a full copy of Portrait Studio if they're really, really great notes. So make sure you're taking your notes if you're interested in those rewards. First question of the day is, when do you know you're ready to work without a reference? I think in relation to what I just said, the list of anatomical components, when you have a good idea of what makes an eye blink, you can start working without a reference. So functional, this is all in regards to portraiture. If you've drawn only 3 armor pieces in your lifetime and you have a commission for $500 for a book cover with a character who has a really advanced type of armor or a specific type of armor that you've never studied before, it is perfectly acceptable to look up a reference. But you should not be looking up pixel for pixel reference for the portrait. By the time you're ready to do commissions at $500 each for book covers and publishing, you should be able to have had enough portraits in your lifetime that you are capable of completely performing all that you need to task-wise and get that same portrait out. Look at that quality portrait out that you would have had with reference. And it's all, again, to do with requirement, anatomical requirement. Then there's perspective. Asking yourself the 3/4 view perspective, rotation, geometric anatomy, all of these things make it so that when you rotate an object, you have a general awareness of all the physical requirements for an object to look like it's rotated, face or not. So when you're ready for reference is when you have done a decent number of studies. You understand fundamentally in your core, you understand why part of a nostril is no longer, why the other side of the nostril is no longer visible when you rotate it. Why you need to maintain your edges, where the direction of the light source is. It's like a song in your heart. Where is the direction of my light source? You never forget that question. That's when you're ready for, working without reference. Also, it's the general internal awareness that you let's say you were doing a photo reference piece. You barely looked at the reference and you still got out with a great portrait. So that's another sign that you're no longer reference dependent. It's you're barely looking at your reference anymore. You're making a lot of the contrast decisions on your own, detailed decisions around an eye socket. You're making a lot of the focal decisions and composition decisions outside of the reference. Those are other indicators that you no longer really need your reference as much to hold your hand. For those who depend too much on reference, every single component of what they're drawing requires a reference. They are cripplingly dependent on reference. So it's a good way to, it's a combination of being aware of yourself as well as general knowledge, it's also to do with self-awareness. So being aware of the knowledge behind the function of an anatomical component. You can list what is required for an eye. How do you make an eye? You can list it out and you won't forget them. For instance, this student here does not know, this person here, does not know what makes an eye. They know a general idea, but they don't think function. They think the plastered outer symbol of what an eye is as something that is familiar and recognizable with a slight little bit of shading here and there. There's no radial shading, almost none. And it's not a reference. It's not a piece that I would say is representative of the student prioritizing function over the illusion of completion or function over completion. So you can paint the painting really, really roughly and have brushstrokes everywhere, but you still incorporated the inner corner and outer corner of the eye. You still incorporated somehow with an edge or two the lower eyelid and the crease. You're still prioritizing function over completion. But a lot of students prioritize completion over function, which is them making it look complete, feeling like it's done, putting a brushstroke wherever they think are the general representatives of the eye, which is eyebrows and upper eyelid, really, at the end of the day, and a really thick lash line. Get rid of the lash line, the student won't know what to replace with that anatomically. They've never done that. And look at how the student has rushed the dark spot of the lash line over the socket. Remember how I looked to the socket to assess whether or not a student is advanced. How advanced an artist is, I look to the eye socket. How have they pulled that off? There's so many intricacies in blending and radial shading and edge work in that little area. That's where I look. Again, if you're trying to assess whether or not it's ready, you're ready for no reference, that's something that I would look to. Can you pull that off without reference? So if I were to list prioritizing different components in the eye, I mean, I could list it functionally, draw this section first, this section, and then that, and keep building on it like in a big pyramid. But I've made videos about that before. I'm just going to talk about what is holding this piece back from being a successful no reference. Which anatomical components are missing from this piece? Other questions are, is there a way to test the vision of your mind's eye against the result on the canvas? I'm not sure what you mean, but that's really just retrospective. You're going to have to take a look at your own, like, kind of close your eyes maybe and try to imagine what you intended. Open your eye, it doesn't match. But the thing is, you're going to be doing that with a memory of what you drew. So that's going to be really abstract. But I can see what you're trying to say. Is there how to keep reference in mind similar to product in canvas? I understand the question. How to do that? Well, it's envisioning, again, is another abstract thing to talk about. But if you have a hard time seeing images in your mind as you want them, spend a little bit more time meditating on what it is that you know. That's not like some sort of hippie meditation thing that I'm trying to like find your inner self and align your chakras. That's not what I mean. Actually try to think about it. Actually just sit there and imagine it with as much detail as possible. Another thing that you can do is try more than once without a reference to draw the same face. You'll get closer and closer each time. Practice is always the variable in the equation that people like to ignore, the time investment. And it's always just instantaneous, like a big flash, and everything should be done. Repetitive revisitations on like the same image in your mind is not an impossible thing to do. It's allowed. It's not allowed. And you can go back and reattempt the same face until what you're imagining and envisioning becomes so clear that this becomes your even default face. The 14-day challenge is actually a wonderful reference-free exercise tool. It's minimally reference dependent, and if you don't know your way around the 14-day challenge, go to Istebrak.com and click on the community tab and scroll down. The Q&A, everything to do with 14-day challenge is there for you to read through. But repetitive, just going back to the same face and trying it again and trying to meditate on what you're trying to see in your mind repeatedly is one good way to match what you imagine with what you're drawing at the end. How to keep that thin difference of keeping gender signatures without ref painting while painting from imagination. You mean how to paint androgynous characters? Another question is how to overcome your brain going on autopilot. When I do art, I always start out thinking about the fundamentals, but at some point my brain goes to wing it mode, especially without reference. If you leave yourself cues along the way, if while you're painting and you're starting to get that wing it, that's discipline. You need to stop. I'm sure you can recognize it as the winging starts happening. You need to make sure you're stopping and going back and looking at your reference. It's like a dance. Your eyes should constantly be expected to move back and forth between your reference and your piece. But if you're working without reference, you have nothing to go back to, and your brain starts to reference what's in there as a cue or muscle memory. Sometimes those cues are bad habits. Sometimes that muscle memory is based off bad habits. But if you leave yourself little indicators here and there for geometric, anything that stabilizes the geometry. For instance, if you leave grids all around identifying where the temples are, if you make sure that you're always going back to your basics with geometry, you won't be able to to dismantle the geometry as you continue painting. If you feel like you are, leave this on a separate layer and turn it on and back and forth. It's a planning process. It's a blueprinting process. So it's all a process. It's not, when you're working with reference, without reference, you no longer have answers given to you by something. Nothing is going to say, hey, have you made sure not to blend away this little shadow? Well, here's a little reminder. Make sure you're, not blending away this little shadow here, because it really needs to stay like this, because this is what you want it to look like. This is your reference. This is your destination. You don't have a destination, so it's very easy to blend away things that you worked on early on. Again, leave yourself little cues. If you feel like you're having a lot of, and you have to find what it is that you're autopiloting. What is it? Is it the blending around the coarse shadows? Is it you're blending away bounce light? Is it anatomy in the eye? Is it this curvature of the eye? If whatever it ends up being, leave yourself cues later on in a separate layer with sketch lines to remind you to go back and preserve your fundamentals. But that's a general term. You have to assess yourself. If I was your private teacher, I'd be able to assess you and give you a specific term. But at this point, Critique Hour can only offer so much. So you have to do a lot of self-reflection. Even in private tutoring, I force my students to do self-reflection. It's a good tool to develop. But what is it that preserve your blank? What is it that you're having trouble with? What do you notice? What do people on the community tell you you're constantly having trouble with? And make sure that you're leaving yourself a little reminder there. That's what's missing, is reminders are lost without reference. You have nothing to remind you other than yourself. It's like a sick person medicating themselves. It's like a sick person being their own therapist. It doesn't work like that, because you always need an outside reference to look in. It's hard managing the labyrinthian mess that is the combination of bad habits, inspiration, and any good fundamentals in place. It's hard managing all of that and still going forward and still healing our problems. Most of the reasons why we get better at art is just us undoing the work we did before. A lot of the reasons why you're getting better is painting less, not painting more. Not painting more in quantity, but doing less work in a painting and actually having each brushstroke count instead of just throwing a bunch of crap on a canvas. You actually have purpose for every single brushstroke. So a lot of it is doing less, constantly removing things. If you learn one fundamental alongside that, as you learn that, you learn 10 bad habits, and you're just removing and picking out all this other stuff as you get better. So keep reminders there. So what write that back to me. When you work without reference, you have no reminders. There are no more reminders, no more checkpoints. There is nothing to reference other than what is in your brain, which is extremely difficult to manage. So leave reminders, create reminders for what you think you will be struggling with later on. When I used to work without reference, the kind of reminder I would keep, and I would always mess it up, no matter how many reminders I kept until I now no longer need it, is the symmetry line. I'm so sorry about my coughing. Every single time I drew something, I would sketch it out, honest to God, sketch it out, keep my symmetry line in place until I start rendering, and then I was like, okay, well, there's a big fucking line moving across. Sorry, try not to swear as much. There's a big line just cutting my painting in half. I want to get rid of it. I want to start seeing something work. I want to start seeing the painting. I want to move forward with this painting. And because I got rid of it, every single new brushstroke I added, and I added tons. Oh my gosh, it would just end up with, I flipped the canvas and I couldn't believe what I was looking at. I was like, after all this work, after putting in the symmetry line, why didn't it work? Is it just me? Do I have a problem? Is it something with my eyesight? Is my brain lopsided and it just naturally wants to draw things at an angle? Am I cursed? Am I possessed? What is it? I went through everything. And I realized that the more I taught, students had the same problems. And when I really started teaching, that's when I started getting into, understanding my problems from back then that I couldn't figure out. Again, one of the biggest ones I couldn't figure out back then, I just couldn't figure it out, along with eyelash thickness, was symmetry line. And it was just because I erased it too soon. And this was the reminder that was missing. I just did not have this constant reference marker. Eventually, the symmetry line was so present when I drew, I saw it projected like right there in my mind. I couldn't unsee it. And that was just because of repetitive revisiting the same face over and over again until I got it down. So for those who think I never did a 14-day challenge, my whole life was a 14-day challenge. All right, so no reference means no reminders, no markers, no extra checkpoint system for yourself to see whether or not you've deviated. And this autopiloting question is a great question because a lot of you hover render. So autopilot can actually be great because it can be you pulling from real reference markers in your mind, real lists of things required for the eyes, things required for the face, things required for three-quarter view. But I hope that the habits you're building are good habits. But most likely, autopilot, hover rendering, is just you applying paint and then just getting sick of the painting and then convincing yourself it's done. And then a bunch of horrible people come out and critique you, and then you're just like, fuck it, I'm just going to start a whole new painting. That does not mean you learned. And I wouldn't count that painting as one step forward. There was something in there that you didn't address, and that was the fact that whatever it was that was going to remind you of, whatever the reminder was going to remind you of, and it could have been a symmetry problem, it could have been an edge work problem. But all of the reasons above are reasons why your painting doesn't look right. So why can't a drawing look well without reference? What's holding it back? Well, there's actual rendering. So rendering. Sorry about the writing. Rendering. So this means all your edges are intact. All your contrast is intact. All your detail is intact. Detail means small brush. Contrast means black versus white. And edges means how strong and sharp your edges are, how clean cut they are, or if they are acute or obtuse edges, how you've pulled that off. If you blended where you need to, have you represented a trench where you need to, etc. So this if you don't do this, no matter how good you identified the components of the anatomy, you're not going to get a complete painting because it just didn't render. Don't confuse rendering for anatomy. Anatomy is a whole other category, a whole other way to organize the knowledge in your mind, right? This is knowledge. This is application knowledge. And then this is specific to the object knowledge. This is general knowledge that can be applied to anything you draw, from hair to rock study. And this is specific to the object knowledge. So the anatomy, what's required for you to pull off a believable portrait? So this list gets long. There's the inner and outer corners of the eyes. There's a curvature of the eye sockets. There's a sphere of the eyeball. There's the placement and perspective applied to the iris and the pupil. There's the eye sockets, radial shading. There's cast shadows. There's the temple and making sure the eyebrow sits slightly into the temple. There's the upper and outer lean of the inner and outer corners of the eyes between genders. Then there's the lower eyelid. And the crease of the lower eyelid, as long as it's not as sharp as the upper eyelid crease. And there's the waterline, and then there's the bit of pink on the waterline leading into the inner and outer corners. There's the specular presence of the light on this level of hydration on the eyeball. Then there's the fact that the entire socket is recessed and interior to the skull, like beneath the medium or surface level of the skull. It's buried into the face. Then there's the nose and the geometric anatomy of the nose, the cube, the square, the triangle, the pyramid, whatever line up in whatever angle. Geometric anatomy can be changed between perspectives, so the respective geometric anatomy for the perspective that you're working with. And then there's scale and likeness and who this character is. What is this character I'm trying to draw? Is it a tomboy who can carry a rocket launcher on her shoulder, or is it kind of like a pencil neck? I'm sorry for the mean terms, but these are the stereotypes we're working with. Is it a pencil pusher? Is it someone who is a lightweight? Is it someone who is all brain? How do I pull that off? I'm maintaining the beauty. How exposed are you to tropes? What kind of character are you gonna be drawing? What role are they playing in the story? What do they offer as a strength? What difficulties do their weaknesses create for them, and how do they overcome them despite their weaknesses with their strengths? How do you pull all that off with a reference, and then without a reference, as minimal referencing as possible, just with a portrait? This has a lot to do with our assignment for apprentices this month. We're going to be doing just that, pulling off a lot of the character with just the bust, but full rein on the bust though. All of this anatomy separate from rendering. A lot of the rendering you can get out of the way with form studies, because you're teaching yourself the tools of pulling off an object in space with it on paper, and the third dimension is missing. All you have is up and down. But in the paper, you can pretend there is a third degree of dimension And then you can pretend things move backward, things can move in and out, shadows can be created because objects can block the light, etc. So you're pretending a lot of the third dimension because you understand the cues of what is required to that when things are three-dimensional. So there's edges, contrast, detail, value sharing, making sure you're not disrupting your value language, your spectrum, your light environment. This is not just these three, it's more, and it's a lot to do with this stuff. And I've repeated this stuff over and over again. The amount of fundamentals you need to know are just a handful of them. They are very, they're massive titans, but there is only a number of them. But anatomy is the one where, yeah, you have tons and tons and tons of tiny little cues that you have to memorize. So I would say, because I want to say that anatomy, that working without reference is memorization. In fact, write it back to me. Working without reference is memorization, but the rules of rendering and the technical aspects of rendering, all of this stuff that makes things look real. So add this to your clause. You can rewrite it to me. Add this to your clause. However, the technical rendering aspects, or the technical units, the technical fundamentals of making things look real on 2D, this is not memorization. This is past memorization. This is your lifestyle. This is, you don't memorize your way throughout things that you feel passionate for. You don't, memorization is something you use in school, something you use momentarily. Memorization is, based off memory, which can fade. I want this to be your DNA. This ability to create something realistic with a missing dimension, and pretending that there's a third dimension, and understanding all the cues of what is required between object, light, and background. This is your DNA. This is your lifeblood. This is what makes things realistic no matter what it is you're drawing. Whereas anatomy is specific to the object, so it's object specific. And that means you can memorize your way through it, because most likely you're going to have to do something else and memorize that. And the memorization isn't always going to be exact, so you're going to be needing some kind of assistance from a reference nearby. Not 100% of the process, but probably 30% of the process, ideally, is what you'll need a reference for. Obviously, the face is the most that you're going to be memorizing. The face, for some people, is part of their DNA. For me, personally, I'm a portrait specialist. I like to think of myself as a portrait specialist. Portrait DNA is part of my... portrait anatomy is part of my DNA. I love it. I love everything about what portrait does, how much expression you can pull off, subtle expression. If I draw a person, I feel like I've done art. That's kind of what it feels to me. For a lot of people, if they draw a landscape, they feel like they've done art. For me, art is portraiture. So, of course, there's all other aspects in it, but I'm not that passionate about them. The storytelling happens a lot with a portrait, mostly for me. So, there's the memorization. So when you're diagnosing yourself, when you don't have someone diagnosing you and looking specifically into your portfolio, when you're just diagnosing yourself, ask yourself, is my ability to not step away from references a result of memorization problems with anatomy specific to the object, or is it a rendering problem? For this student, it's a rendering problem and a little bit of anatomy. They're missing a lot of what they need in order to make this realistic and complete it. The first and most important thing, this rendering problem, they're trying to create a character in a world. I see this character as like, if I were to add a story, like a very simple story, I probably would say it's more of a plain character, but the expression is so vogue, the style of the hair is so vogue, the oversized jacket, it's all just really very general fashion kind of depiction of the character's presence in the canvas. I don't see much of a story tied in. I like when there is a story, a bit of a story pushed in there. But for this character, aside from this problem with lack of story, the kind of rendering missing is the kind that makes me want to grayscale everything you've ever touched and have you revisit it. It makes me want to have the whole community after you to make sure you're doing some nose studies and edge studies and form studies. Because what you've done here is you've gotten to the point where you think you're ready for color. How could you possibly have diagnosed yourself to be ready for color if the edges of the nose are not complete? You must have thought they were complete under a very painterly style. No, painterly style does not. Painterly has never meant stepping away from radial shading. You can still pull off a lot of the radial shades required. So this may have been referenced. I think it is actually. I think it's the Twilight Girl. But I'm just going to pretend like it's not referenced. So these requirements here is all part of memorization for me. I know the nostril is radial. I know the nostril doesn't melt into the face. There's an edge. I know the geometric anatomy of the nose. And I know the part of the nose looks down, so I've created an edge here, another edge. Remember those edges? I know the septum moves down into a little bit of a curve down here. I know the septum, I know the nose is also very radial, so I'm going to gradually introduce values into the nose, so the nose looks like it can breathe. It's moving up. And look, the completion status, if there was a bar for completion, the bar has moved. Okay? I don't know why it's not painting. Oh, right. The bar is moving up. Right, so if there's a completion level right here, it's moving up. Because what I've added is radial shading, edges, and geometric anatomy has all been checked off. So remember, working without reference is a combination of anatomy knowledge and then the lifeblood of what makes something realistic on 2 dimensions. That's all separate from each other. And a lot of the reasons why you guys can't work without reference is because you need constant cues on where to put an edge. If you need constant reminder that an edge is important, you have a lot of education left to work on. You have a lot of mileage left to accomplish. So that goes back to the question, when am I ready to work without reference? Do you recognize when you need an edge? Have you memorized the combination of edge work requirement as well as anatomy requirement? Do you understand how to pull off an edge that is required in the anatomy list? So let's say you went through your anatomy list and you're great with your anatomy list. You remember everything. I rarely find students like this though. Students who memorize the face and what is required on the face, but they can't draw. I've never met anyone like that before, but I'm sure they exist. But let's just say you are. Let's just say you memorized everything you need to know about a face, which didn't have the skill to pull it off. Are you an artist? That's the question. What do you guys think? I want an answer. Are you still an artist if you memorized all anatomy but you can't draw it? You can't pull it off. You don't know how to apply what midtone to what brush, to what size brush, to what color or value brush, when to stop painting, when to blend, when not to blend, how to climb the values radially or just leave them flat, how to blend different values while still preserving some level of detail, how to make, how to shrink your brush and when to apply micro detail, how to enlarge your brush and to apply molar brush strokes. Which one of those two makes you more of an artist? Really big question. Yeah. Well, I would say a doctor can be all memorization. But, you're still called a doctor if you memorized everything and graduated medical school. You're not called a practicing doctor, or you're not a licensed doctor if you haven't worked in the practice of the field. So I understand, but the thing is with doctors that they're still called doctors even though they graduated and memorized all the anatomy. That's the problem with your analogy, is that they're still called doctors. But a licensed doctor, yeah, that would be very different. No, you're not an artist. Just from memorizing anatomy, you're not an artist. What makes you an artist, what defines you as the artist that can produce pictures on a flat piece of paper, is your fundamental knowledge, which is knowing when edges happen, knowing when to blend, knowing when not to blend. So the question of when do I work without reference is not a question you should be worried about if you're only 4 noses in your life. If you've only ever drawn like 4 noses. That's not how it works. And it's not a question you should be worried about. At the end of the day, what I always finish off with, especially for students who are really worried about when to step away from reference, if they feel like they're just so scared, they want to be able to call themselves an artist and deserve the title. I tell them don't worry so much about it, because even pros use reference from time to time, and that's a pro. But medium pros, let's say, dime a dozen, garden variety pros, they use references constantly. Also, the term professional also means just whoever gets hired a lot. So that's also in there in the mix of what a professional means. So don't be so worried about rushing into no reference. But remember that if in the end of the day you are aiming for a future where you're very independently drawing without too much reference, and you're not so worried about face variety, you feel like you understand the differences in measurements and nose width compared to eye width, lip type, and the character design that you're going for, then you feel like you're never going to use reference. And remember, what makes an artist is not their memorization of anatomy, but their understanding of the fundamentals, their ability to pull off 3 dimensions in just 2 dimensions. Okay, so what has made this nose look like it's existing in 3 dimensions, even though all I have are the 2 dimensions in my like fake paper on this digital screen? Well, there was the core shadow, the direction of the light that I established, the bounce light here, no value sharing for the upper lip, dark spots on the inner and outer corner of the mouth, though I should just stick to the nose for now. Bounce light on the shiniest parts of the nose, because that upper lip is bouncing back up. And I'm going to lighten this even more and be even more picky with my darkest values. Then there's the skin tone that you use, which is just a little bit off. It's a lot of bit off. Right, so I'm just gonna, it's really hard to work around this contrast that you have. I'm just going to put this actually everywhere. I'm going to use a darken layer on that same mid-tone here that I used on the nose. I'm just going to use it everywhere, because the skin is looking really murky. And I'm going to pull in some believable values here for the highlights. Okay, so again, I'm establishing the geometric anatomy. I know where the light is coming from. I'm applying the values on the cheeks, moving away from that ashy kind of skin tone that you're working with. I'm going to reintroduce all of those dark spots again in a second. Making sure there's no value sharing. I'm blocking along my general knowledge outside of anatomy of how to make an object look realistic. The entire forehead is elevated outside of any other value range. Its only equivalent is the nose and the face. I'm borrowing from values I would use on the nose. I'm finding a mid-tone value for anything here that is not highlight. And slowly but surely, I'm not using a reference. I'm building a believable climb in values along this face. It's no longer about the object. It's no longer about the subject, it's about the object. This area here needs to be blocked and set up. You're using a red as a shadow, and it's hard for me to work around that at the moment. But going back into the nose, now that we have a good general, because I can pull off that nose situation there without identifying kind of like a nice spectrum. But now that we've done that, I can radially introduce the darkest value of the nose, shrinking my brush as I apply paint. The nose looks like it can breathe, and this is a function of this anatomy group that I'm aware of, that I need, and that's what I'm going to be applying with a guidance to it. Like, I'm not depending too much on reference, but I am basing it off the references I used to use. So there is still a reference you're using. It's just this time you've actively categorized it in your brain and you are using it when you need it. So now I'm going to blend around all of these little areas here. I'll do one more review to make sure I'm not valley sharing. Again, if it might not end up looking like the girl this was intended to look like, but that's okay. Alright. I need to zoom in. I'm blending the sides, increasing the brush, which is something you would have learned with your organic form studies, how to blend around massive curves. I'm sharpening the edge around here, so the how to work well with reference is just having all your edges where they need to be. As well, like your rendering has a lot to do with clean presentation, because that's what a picture would have promoted if you had had that as a reminder. Right, so this is a big part of why what needs to be cleaned up when you're working without reference. And then there's just that whole eye problem that's happening. If she's wearing makeup, this is just the wrong kind of makeup to be using in your art right now, but because I used a reference, I'm just going to use one of the midtones here to lighten that cast shadow here along the eyes. And then the lower eyelid as well. We do need shadows there, but they don't have to be that dark. And you're not really studying color, by the way. Whoever this artist is, you're not studying color. You've stylized all your color. You're not using real skin tones. So have you really studied color? Because I had to introduce an entirely new skin tone here in your palette. Placing in the eyebrows with a lot of pigment. And I'm also ending them off early. Just based off what my visual library has in it for what eyebrows do. I'm over blending the dome. She's a female. That's another thing I've put away and categorized in my mind. Females have more dome-like foreheads, so I have to over blend. It's not over blending, it's blending just as much, but over blending in comparison to what you guys do sometimes. I'm just using my smudge brush. Smudge is very important. If you haven't been convinced yet about how important it is to smudge as you paint, look at my history in my video, track it down. Just do a history search on my videos and you'll find it, smudging. What are edges? That's the video title. Okay, making sure all my stuff here, and I'm not using a reference because this is stuff that I remember is required anatomically per subject. So I want to ask you all this question now. You personally, you viewers, which of you are having an anatomy memorization problem? Which of you are having a form and rendering problem? And which of you have both? If you have both, you have a lot of work ahead of you. Okay. And then I'm going to grab that really nice white, just pure white on a low opacity soft brush. I'm just placing it on all these areas that can get moist. I'm also going to get this green left over from the previous palette, and I'm going to use it under the eyes. I need to work on the eyes, so I'll work on those in a second. I'm going to get some of that red, leaving the eyes last because it's just a mouthful. Putting in some blush with a color layer. And for those videos, I've seen so many of those fucking videos on YouTube. Why grayscale is bad, how to use grayscale, and why I don't do it. The people who don't know how to transfer from grayscale to color, people who don't understand that, or people who don't understand their values. All it is just colors have a certain kind of value requirement. Make sure your value is there. When you transfer, everything else just falls into place. It's that simple, yes. If you're trying to pull off a yellow in a skin tone and you started off dark, it's because you didn't understand, first of all, what color you're going to be transferring into. And maybe you took way too long to transfer into color, because half the process should be in color once you're done with your grayscale. And if you want to do 100% grayscale, that is also possible, and then apply color later with a color layer. You could also do that if you just understood what your intention for the values were. You can't go willy-nilly. You have to decide your value, your light environment. If those videos, take a look at their light environment, what color they were trying to do. I didn't watch them, but take a look at the color they were trying to pull off. Is it the wrong color for the light environment? Most likely. Okay, I'm using that white color, or actually some of that pink came in. I'm just going to use that white again. Side of that layer mode. Just going to use it on the forehead. My understanding of texture and what hair does is a texture. Hair is texture. Hair is a texture study. And you know, I need to blend hairlines, apply the texture with like a difference, with a negative space. So I get my brush stroke, and I apply that in this way. And by default, like by the negative space that's coming out of these brush strokes, using the skin tone layer, I'm getting a hair texture. And you just keep applying this. It's getting a bit high, this hairline. And once you're done with this stage, go ahead and shrink your brush and apply all the hair texture you want. And make sure you started it off as a texture you understood it has to be one. It can't be just you starting off with a small little paintbrush to pull off the hair because you're throwing off the focal point. Same exact thing with the eyebrows, brushing down, using the outer layer of color to create that initial silhouette of the texture. I'm zoomed out. Alright, for the eyes, so there's the inner corner, quick little placement there. And then I'm connecting that lower eyelid back. If she has eye bags, you have to consider those later. They are a separate entity from the lower eyelid. Eyelid and eye bag don't always mix. Maybe if you get old enough. Alright, so I'm throwing in those little eye bags and blending away. So a lot of people are both. A lot of people are anatomy, a lot of people are rendering. What videos are for experts? Sorry. Are these rendering videos? Alright, and as I talked about it before, the socket. Really tricky thing, the socket. It's really just a complete test of your ability to, like, your whole rendering spectrum, everything that you need to pull off a render is really tested with an eye socket. That's the hardest part of the eye, in my opinion. I mean, hardest for the student. Once you get a grasp of it, it's easy peasy. Okay, and then we are getting rid of this thick lash line. This thick lash line is a sign of a weak artist. Write that back to me. Anytime you see a thick lash line, if for any artist, tell them Istebrak sends her regards. No, I'm joking. Also, I always repeat, oh, never mind. The reason why it's a weakness point is because you're hiding anatomy with it, but you're still getting away with it because thick lash lines do exist in makeup. So you think you're playing some kind of little magic trick and you're to represent some skill level, but you're not. You're just representing your weakness because you don't know the anatomy in there. Because in this point, your inability to work without reference is an anatomy problem. Yeah. Weak sauce? Is that what I said? Did I seriously say sauce? Thick lash line is a sign of a weak artist. my priority is to learn form, anatomy, rendering, and all these before learning color, but I do want to study how to apply proper values in color rather than transferring from grayscale. Absolutely, you don't have to use grayscale. This is just for people who want to feel safe. It's a safety net. But I'm saying it is possible to use it. It's possible to get away with it. Okay, making sure I'm not value sharing. Nice little crease line for the lower eyelid. Right here, shadow line here. I'm thinning out that lash line because it just does not need to be this thick for the eyes to function. Okay, and moving back into the eye socket. I'm zooming out because it's heavy duty work. I need to be able to see what my changes are. Some shadow moving down here. Cast shadow. And it's usually where I spend most of my time on an eye socket. And this is typically how I kind of work without reference. I'm just going through the anatomy requirements, but I have the skill to pull off, I hope I have the skill to pull off what is required for creating this three-dimensional object on this two-dimensional medium. Do you understand the difference now? That's what today's session was all about, understanding the difference of what's really required of you when you can move into attempting stuff without reference. What you have to spend the most time on. And it's all self-diagnosis. You can only tell. Oh, I don't have it assigned because it keeps resetting because Photoshop is garbage. Right, so I'm just blending away. I want that organic look. Everything is blended together. I'm not done with the eye socket. It's going to look like a different girl, but that's okay. I'm just following what my brain wants to do when it comes to the likeness because I don't really have a goal destination. All I really know is I want to draw a face. Sometimes that's okay. But if you are working with an employer and they do require that you draw their character and you draw a character with a hooded eye and they just didn't want a hooded eye, you're going to have to learn how to, or if they wanted a hooded eye, you're going to have to learn how to apply that. So this is that eye socket I talk about that makes the eyes feel nice and hooded. Nice and full. And for me, what I feel like doing, because I'm just not feeling this kind of eyes. I feel like lowering that line here. Just having that nice hood there. Really pretty. And these are all my own personal choices. And eventually everything will start coming together once I establish a nice little neighborhood of values specific to the eye as a socket. So all this climbing I'm doing with the values, I'm bringing it back down. And I'm just going to use that green again. I'm going to find that green. It's mostly just this kind of shift. And I'm using it under the eye. I'm going to bring in this white, shift it in with some like paler yellows. And just throwing in those big, shiny, wet chunks of skin that kind of get a little translucent and pale because she's kind of pale. And that's kind of what I'm throwing on top. I'm going to create that little ring that's kind of like an on switch of highlight that sits on the face. The lips still have a lot of work to do. Then we have the lower eyelid not being so dark. And I'll bring in the specular highlights later. I'm going to finish some anatomy requirements, which is the inner corners and that really pink stuff. And that's just, you just have to go into the color picker and get it. Sometimes it's not in your palette. Really takes the eye to the next level. And I'm not worried about the white of the eye not being white enough. I'm just concerned about the general formation of this and all the anatomical components. That's all I'm worried about, just making sure everything is there. And obviously I prioritize this eye socket because it should be one of the most important dark circles or dark spots in the eye. Prioritize what needs to be prioritized. And then maybe I'll start bringing in some nice whites in there. When I'm done, if I feel like I want it, sometimes I stylistically omit the specular lights in the eye just because they kind of make everything look a little magazine. And for me, I always kind of thicken eyebrows just a touch. For girls, I started getting very, after drawing a million pretty faces, I started getting very sick of the pretty eyebrow. I started flattening it, bringing in a boy brow. It started to get really fun. And I'm just smudging. Everything is intact because everything has been promoted. Everything has been promoting the geometry, and geometry has been promoting everything. Don't know if that makes sense, but now I'm starting to use again the negative space to draw detail into the eyebrow without actually shrinking my brush and drawing every single little hair. It's a more professional way to do it, bringing in detail gracefully and not detailing like a douche, as Peter Moorbacher puts it, or texturing like a douche. It's one of the first YouTube videos I ever watched. What's a video he made? And then we have some more shine on any wet areas. I'm zooming out for this. I don't like the placement of the pupil. I don't think it's right. I'm just gonna blend it from this distance. I don't know if that Peter Moorbacher video is still up. I really don't know. I'm trying to kind of create the feeling of the lower eye socket, the lower bag, without actually drawing it in. Just a tonal change. And guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to completely get rid of that, the interior and exterior part of the lash line. It's really not that required. It's keeping the eyes back a little bit. Just thickest towards the center. Still painterly. Still what you were going for. But it's respected the rules. I'm still on lighten. Okay, all the rules are still intact. And I'm just creating this slide effect between the nose and the forehead. The nose still has its geometries, but it's functional. And then, of course, there is the radial shading of the lips, which is non-existent, which is even more reason for this artist to stop, drop, and form study. So we shrink our brush as we apply the paint so the mouth looks like it's part of the face. And we always want to overblend the mouth. Or at least start it as a base overblended so you understand what you're doing. Then there's the cylindrical upper and lower shadows, core shadows, again back to geometric anatomy, the geometric equivalent of the anatomy structure you're trying to draw. All this stuff makes stuff look realistic. Realism is not in the list of the anatomy. That's just a checkpoint requirement for biology. That's just a biology checkpoint. A checklist. Realism happens in the form. So do you guys understand how anatomy is not the realism? Do you guys understand that? That list, that first list we drew with the form, that's your bread and butter. That's how you make things look realistic. And there's that white outline. A little bit of the outline around the Cupid's bow. So why again is form the actual carrier of the realism when you're working no reference? Why is it the form and not the anatomy? I'm going to try to create that pocket in there. Really, really nice. Kind of like we all drool just a little bit, just like how the eyes are always wet. They're just lubricated. The lips always need just a little bit of wetness so they can keep working. But I'm keeping the lips under rendered because it's just how lips do. Zooming all the way out to check that chin light that I have. Blending it might correct it, but I'm doing, and I feel like the eyebrow is a little bit too light where the light touches. Skin is oily, and there's a lot of oil under the eyebrow, and it reflects through the eyebrow pigment. What I would do is erase the pupil. I mean, this is how I do it. I don't paint the pupil right away, the iris and the pupil right away. I bring them in later. This gives me a second chance to thin out the lash line even more. And I bring it in with a nice, perfect circle. Again, damn it, an anatomical requirement for the eyes. An anatomical requirement for the eyes is the perfect circle of the pupil and the iris. I just use a basic round brush. You can make it a large pupil if that's what you want, but look at the realism that brought in. Just that perfect circle. And then we are using the same one for the internal darkest value. Gosh dang it. No, I need to zoom in for this. My aim is completely off. You're just faking light without understanding form. Sean, that was beautiful. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. Because you'll just be faking the light if all you have is anatomy knowledge. God, that was beautiful. Exactly. So today I could have just gone through the motions and just, did my critique hour, did a paint over with some slight mention and reference to these external fundamentals, but I really wanted to talk about what it means to work without reference. What it really comes down to. And it always comes down to your form knowledge. That's why it's never wasted time. It's just another way for me to prove to you that it's kind of want to make her eyes like blanked out. It's always fun to do that, because every artist and their mom does that. Yeah, what really goes into rendering an eye? No, what really goes into? I'm sorry, I'm just having a lot of fun. Working without reference. There we go. It's more stylistic. Sorry, I'm just I'm just drawing. I'm just trying to add that stylization, and I'm just going to blur the whole thing. And then whatever my primary light source was, that's kind of what I would use to illuminate the eye. There's nothing wrong with going with a brown eye, though. But because of all these extra colors this student used, I kind of just want to do that. Whenever you do a colored eye, make sure the white of the eye has also been colored blue. Okay. And there's the shadow of the lash line on the upper eyelid, but you get the idea. Right? So using a perfect circle really, really is great. Let me just outline a perfect circle even better by making it pure brown. And remember, a large sized pupil, we've done this before, is great. A large sized iris, sorry. But an iris that has been shrunk brings in a degree of realism with it that's just really great for your portfolio. Not every character you have has sparkling magic eyes. Like, you have this maturity in your portfolio when you take it easy with the pupil size and the iris size. Please don't forget the shadow of the upper eyelid, though, which I'm going to add right now. Alright, and then sometimes you can go a little bit crazy with the specular, but stylized, like you can add that little explosion of white just on the waterline sometimes. Just a touch. And it's got like, holy shit, pen pressure. It's gonna do it again. Merge layers. So you can add something really simple just like that. So any more questions at all about today's session? Just some more touches here and there. You can compare where we were before. For this student, it's mostly form, but a lot of it is anatomy. So now I have this comfort level. I can take my time, shrink my brush. This is where you start shrinking your brush. This is when it's legal to shrink your brush. And actually create some folds, some creases, some extra little detail here and there. I'm going to just create a big haze over the lower part of the eye. That's the water pooling towards the lower half. Sometimes we have a bit of brightness towards the top, just a bit of reflection. Sometimes we can bring in this bounce light color and diffuse an entire lower eyelid area because that's just the subsurface doing its thing. But I like what's happening with the lower eyelid, and I want to play with that a little bit more. This is really low resolution. Give yourself enough, like 2500 by 2500 at least. See how the lash line was just nothing? Didn't do anything for us. Before, very muddy colors, very green. The contrast kind of just seemed to glow out of the camera on the face. After, we're thinking about a light source coming from above, more peachy skin tones, but I really would work on the hair, or just get rid of the hair completely for your next 14-day challenge. Let's just consider this your first 14-day challenge submission, and then just move on from there. Your next one is day 2. Remove some color. You need to start thinking about your edges a little bit better. I have a question about Reddit, but I don't want to get off the topic of not to use reference. So you can start your, off-topic questions now. We're pretty much done. I'm done here. I'm having some problems blocking objects that are not cubes or spheres. They're having some problems blocking. In Photoshop Portrait Studio, there's a twisted cube that I haven't been able to do without making the side look like a flat gradient. I think this is a blending problem because you should have blocked the general areas. Like, I'm not sure how to refer to them. The categories of value before they are blended, the degrees of the spectrum, as it shifts from dark to light. You should be able to block those in easily. But the blending, I think, is what's throwing you off. But I'd have to see your work. How to make something look more realistic without looking creepy. The creepy comes from bad anatomy knowledge. When you are creepy, I think is what you mean by uncanny. Things look creepy when they're unrealistic anatomically, but realistic form-wise. When they're realistic physically, structurally. Any tips on getting the symmetry when painting a face from scratch? Keep your symmetry line on another layer and keep going back to it to double check. Flip your canvas. I started to really focus on drawing last year, and I find that I don't know what to study first. What would be a recommendation to me studying? I'm studying perspective at the moment. Perspective isn't going to do a lot for you, Samuel. You should be studying light on form, light environment, edges. You should be trying to draw fabrics, folds in fabrics, deep folds, wide folds. You should be trying reflective materials, matte materials. You should be trying complex geometric polygons and organic shapes and organic patterns, big bumpy surfaces, globular shapes. That's where you should be going right now. And of course, couple that with a healthy amount of portraiture and a healthy amount of whatever it is you end up adding with portrait. If it's environment, do some environment studies. But at the end of the day, it all goes back to your bread and butter, which is your form. Can we have homework as form studies for the next session? You can if you want to, yeah, definitely. There's nothing stopping you guys from doing that. I'll talk to them here. I'm not very familiar with Reddit yet about flares and no tags, but I'll discuss that with my team tonight. I don't really know how to answer your question, George. You guys want a class on how to do form studies specifically? I'll think about it. Where to start and how to advance. There are a couple, but they're pretty old. You know what? It's official. Next class is going to be about form studies. Please complete form studies for Thursday, and I'll do a whole class on form studies, okay? 2 people asking is a lot, is enough for me. Next class is going to be about what? You will complete your homework and post it where? I want the answers. Please go to Reddit to post your homework. Make sure you're going here, sign up, and post your homework here. For our next class is homework study. The hair, all this stuff is a lot left to work on. I don't have time to work on all of it because I'm painting live. This isn't time lapse. So you guys will have to kind of just separate the hair for now from today's session, apart from that hairline touch. God bless form studies. Form studies anxiety intensifies. Form studies on Reddit. Thank you, Pumpkin. Thank you, Alicia. Yes. Form studies posted on Reddit. Thank you. So do anything. Do complex form studies. Do the crazy shit. Do organic form studies. Do fabric studies. These are all considered form studies. This is the stuff that we talked about right at the start of the class, that little list at the top. That defining artistic skill that is specific to artists, being able to depict form on nothing but 2 dimensions, create an artificial 3rd dimension that looks damn good. That's what makes you an artist that can draw. And I'm not talking about the abstract definition of an artist. I'm talking about the actual concept artist and an illustrator, an animator, being able to depict something in space with nothing but lines or edges, right? That's what makes you. Knowing anatomy is not enough. So that's what we're going to be studying on Thursday. That's the lesson of today. Bless Istebrak and Reddit and form studies. So thank you everyone for joining today. If you guys want to be patrons and give back to the community, you can go to istebrak.com and join as a patron. Our assignments for this month have already been handed out, as well as last month's critique hour for the character design assignment that we had. It was a really, really set of beautiful illustration. It was a really beautiful set of illustrations handed in. We've been doing a lot of narrative based work, a lot of heavy narrative stuff. Always thinking about the story, the destination. It's hard to paint without having a backstory. So all the design decisions that you make have to do with narrative. So you guys want to get in on all of that and the extra lesson. That'll be out soon. Very, very soon I will post the postcard video thanking all of you who sent postcards for Christmas. I love you all so much. Thank you all for the stuff you sent me, the origami, the little keychains. I have not forgotten you. Thank you. I will do a video very soon. Portrait Studio for Mac will be out February 1st. The Villain Challenge will start February 1st. I'll hand out the resource pack starting February 1st, but you can still get started on compiling some references. And Patreon rewards are still upcoming for January. Thank you all for joining. I will see you guys on Thursday for some form studies. Bye.